questions at the end after both presenters. So our next presenter is DeSantis. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Southern Virginia. He also teaches in the philosophy department. Theology department. He is our resident theologian of our cohort for our PhD. And I am super excited to announce Cole is going to be presenting on the impact of AI on psychological development and popular conceptions of the mind. After you are ready.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Obviously, a lot of the topics for this conference are very dense, and mine is no exception, but I'll try to keep it within the time limit. Now, before I get into the core of my topic, I'm going to kind of deal with something that's a little bit off to the side, but kind of provide some context. Obviously, anyone who's been through this program before at the Humanities and Technology program at Salve, or anyone who's currently going through it, will know that one name that comes up a lot is obviously Martin Heidegger. And one of the cornerstones of Heidegger's philosophy is that technology is, in his view, something that allows us to manipulate nature to such a degree that we can radically reframe how humans envision and relate to nature. The often repeated example provided by Heidegger is in showcasing the difference between pre-modern and post-modern technology is obviously different forms of energy acquisition. Take, for example, the windmill or the water wheel. Those two forms of energy acquisition can only be built in places where there's a lot of wind or where there's a near body of water or something. How much energy you get from it is obviously based on how strong the wind is on average, how fast the water is moving. But then you skip ahead to the modern era. One thing that you see is forms of technology like the burning of coal or the splitting of the atom. And so what you see in a lot of the pre-modern forms of technology is we're still, to some degree, at the expense of nature. How much energy we get from nature and how we get energy from nature is obviously rooted in, the different elements of fire, well, I guess you could say fire, but, water and wind. Whereas when you look at the splitting of the atom, when you look at the burning of coal, you're literally making some fundamental change to nature itself, right? Like you're splitting an atom. You're turning some sort of mineralogical substance into fire. You're combining things that normally wouldn't combine. You're transforming something into something else. The broader point that Heidegger is making is that the pre-modern forms of energy acquisition represent par excellence the concept of truth as aletheia, that is, self-disclosure, or unconcealment, or revelation, that is, the core of a thing's being making itself known or manifest to us. Things in nature, they exist a certain way, they function or unfold in a certain way, and in doing so, reveal some core element of its identity to us. Modern forms of energy acquisition are different, because with pre-modern forms of energy acquisition, you have to deal with what you got, right? With a lot of contemporary or modern forms of energy acquisition, you're not just simply accepting nature as it is and working with what you've got. You have the ability to change certain elements of nature or direct it to whatever end you want. We don't just let reality or the world exist as it is and unfold as it will and then respond to it. We make some fundamental change to it. The moral message here should, to some extent, be clear. Modern technology allows us to assert ourselves in the world to such a degree so as to allow us to not just accept the order or structure of the world, but to radically reframe it. With the rise of artificial intelligence, I believe something similar is happening in the realm of education. Every tool that's ever been employed makes some sort of change to the learning process. Yet the effects and implications of AI, in my opinion, are so vast and so far-reaching so that it allows us to radically reframe the meaning of education by creating a radical reorientation of our epistemic and cognitive priorities, and therefore our educational or pedagogic goals. What I hope to argue today is that AI reinforces a certain trend that, in some sense, not only goes back to the earliest days of civilization, but was actually one of the things that precipitated the rise of civilization. Starting with the invention of tools, emerging from which we see the creation of more advanced hunting techniques, more advanced social structures, more advanced forms of production. With that, you see the prioritization of more linear or discursive modes of thinking. This was something only amplified in much of the classical philosophical and scientific thought of civilized man, which is obviously very logical, very deductive, very, step by step, obviously. Yet, the one thing that the classic tradition had that I think we're losing in the modern era is that the classical tradition, even though deeply rooted in a very linear form of thinking, was still somewhat dynamic. It did not see non-linear forms of thinking as necessarily being completely overshadowed by or irrelevant. It tried to, in some sense, synthesize the linear and the non-linear, the discursive as opposed to the what could be called intuitive or creative forms of thinking. AI, on the other hand, not only reinforces the tendency towards more linear forms of cognition that would define most of human history, but is also reductionistic in nature. And we'll get into that a little bit later on in the presentation. Let me begin with a historical consideration. The capacity to create and mass produce tools both presupposes and reinforces more linear forms of thinking. That is, a form of thinking rooted in the ability to choose ends and create step-by-step processes by which to attain these ends. Many of the earliest tools created by humans were created for the purpose of hunting. Both hunting, considered as an activity in itself, and the forms of social cooperation that large-scale hunting necessitates, both serve to reinforce as well as make more sophisticated these forms of linear thinking. Certain specific changes in our diet over the course of human history led to an increase in our brain size, which in turn led to the creation of complex societies, and with it, the rise of language, newer and more advanced forms of technology, and then obviously the bureaucratic and political processes involved with creating and maintaining a society, along with the mindset implicit to the creation of coherent languages and the invention of technology, is very linear in nature, and thus created the context for the rise of things like science or math or philosophy, and engineering and similar areas of study. Hominids, prior to the invention of tools, were defined, like with most animals, by cognitive processes that were very much kind of, I don't want to say down to earth, but very much in tune with the more cyclical patterns of nature. With the invention of tools, we kind of, in some sense, were forced to step back. We could control and influence nature and not be entirely at its mercy. And this thus allowed the human mind to go from, being, and I don't mean this in a new agey sort of sense, but to be in some sense microcosms of nature to being more linear in nature. Nonetheless, when one examines the classical sources of philosophy, and people use the term classical very often in an overly limited sense, I mean most of both Eastern and Western philosophy prior to the last, the start of the modern era. In most of the classical sources of philosophy, it was not reductionistic in nature. It was very linear, but it wasn't reductionistic. And that's because they saw linear, discursive, deductive forms of thinking as being inseparably linked to experiential and quantitative forms of knowledge. True forms of knowledge, to be more precise, were not simply a knowledge of propositions or the logical relations between them. You also saw the phenomenological elements, the conceptual elements, intuition, creativity, also playing a role. There was a lot of debate about how exactly these different forms of knowledge related to each other. There was a lot of debate on how to prioritize them, but for most of human history, there was this notion that all these different forms of knowledge could coexist, they did coexist, and they were inseparable. Now, let me, just say on my side, I don't want to be reductionistic on my part. So as a sort of prefatory note, I will say that there are a myriad of cultural, philosophical, and intellectual factors that led to this dynamic vision sort of being abandoned or flattened out. But I do believe that one of them has to do with the rise of artificial intelligence. AI has, as one of its foundational premises, the notion that it's possible for machines to imitate human cognition. But obviously, since AI and computers are fundamentally information processing machines, this then led to the notion that if computation's the primary form of knowledge in a machine-based form of knowledge, that must be the defining feature of human knowledge. You see this, for example, with Alan Turing, the famous British computer scientist, who was one of the early thought leaders who kind of laid the basis for AI. Basically said if a computer could produce an answer to a question that on the surface was indistinguishable from a human, that must mean that humans and AI operate functionally the same. An even more hardline version of this mindset was in the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who went another step further and basically said that computation is the primary cognitive act. Everything else, whether it be consciousness, creativity, any kind of non-computational form of rationality, is a secondary function of the human mind. And so obviously Dennett takes on a much more hardline stance. Now one could argue that the American educational system and the educational systems of most developed nations were already kind of heading in this direction due to the prioritization of quote-unquote practical skills over things like creativity or critical thinking. Yet it would appear that the widespread proliferation of AI in the educational process leads to this disproportionate emphasis on computation to infect how we view education to ever greater degrees. By the way, just to be absolutely clear again, not saying the issue is AI as such. I would argue it's primarily in the irresponsible use of AI. But again, we're like giving monkeys, an advance over technology. We're only slightly more advanced than that. We saw AI and we didn't know how to handle it, right? And I think we began to use it in such a way that it unintentionally flattened out this sort of dynamic view of thought and cognition that, was assumed by most older forms of education. Now all of this leads to the following question. One, how does the widespread use of AI actually impact the learning process? And two, how does the widespread use of AI lead to a shift in the prioritization of our cognitive functions or our view of the human mind? AI is such a new form of technology. There's not a lot of information out there. But one study that I found showed that college students preferred feedback on their performance from teachers over that produced by generative AI, but not by a large margin. Actually, I would like to thank one of my cohort members for making reference to this study over the course of our academic studies. Was like, that sounds really interesting. I looked it up myself, got really deep into it. It's very telling information. Again, students, they preferred feedback from teachers over generative AI, but not by a lot. And in some areas, when you broke down the information, actually they preferred generative AI over the human teachers. The conclusions show that 49.7% of students prefer feedback from generative AI, while 50.3% did not. Drawing on data taken from 6,960 students from 4 different Australian universities, the study concluded that 1,981 of them described AI-generated academic feedback as quote-unquote somewhat helpful, as opposed to 1,362 who made similar claims about teachers. While more students described teachers than AI as quote-unquote very helpful, the differences were actually a lot smaller. It was 1,373 in favor of teachers versus 813. The majority of students saw AI as more easily accessible, providing more immediate answers, and as being able to provide answers to a wider variety of questions. The majority of students, 79.6%, also believe that AI performed better at helping them understand the material. Now, They believe that human teachers did a better job at helping them to reflect upon the material more deeply, but in terms of just the concrete understanding of, okay, the text says 1 + 1 = 2, well, what does that mean? In terms of just understanding it on that level, AI did a better job. What this seems to indicate is that a growing emphasis on objectivity in a sort of quantifiable or factual sense and quickness in the production of information is what is valued above all else. This is borne out by the data. Students overall saw AI as being superior at producing information in a straightforward, unbiased manner. Teachers, on the other hand, were seen as superior to AI in terms of producing information that was more contextual, seeing AI as being at times vague or irrelevant or not in tune with context. Only 29.1% of students saw AI as superior to teachers in helping to facilitate deeper reflection. The primary cause of the difference in strengths and weaknesses between humans and AI is caused by the fact that humans and AI are both seen as being precision-oriented, but in very different ways. Humans are seen as better at being more in tune with the details of context, whereas AI tended to be more in tune or more precision-oriented when it came to facts and information. So, now, what one sees here is a general trend, namely the belief that humans may have the advantage when it comes to less easily quantifiable but more qualitatively significant elements of education. Nonetheless, AI, whose purpose it is simply to memorize and regurgitate information, is a lot better at the more quantifiable elements of education. That is, with respect to helping proliferate and memorize purely factual or empirical pieces of information. The widespread use of AI among students may be due in part not to a rejection of the role of the human element, but rather as the belief that the cornerstone of education is simply the reception or memorization of data. Any tool that can quicken, truncate, or expedite this process is seen as an integral and indispensable part of the educational process. And this can be seen in the priorities that a lot of students have concerning education. One recent study shows that 51% of students pursue college education due to the possibility of acquiring a higher paying job. 40% reported that it was due to the fact that their field of interest requires the degree. 39% reported that it was to open up new career opportunities. While these reasons are in many ways valid, and though they may reflect more than just AI, they reflect, probably the more general utilitarian mindset of our culture, the over-reliance on AI kind of flattens out the dynamics of human life and thereby creates a mindset where it reinforces this overly utilitarian approach to education. Now, obviously, we can complain about the problems all we want, but this, of course, leads to the question, what are you going to do about it? Is there anything we can do about it? And I would basically recommend two things. And the first thing I would recommend doing is we need to see a shift in our sort of cognitive priorities. We need to move away from a strictly computational view to a more phenomenologically oriented view. You see this, for example, with the philosopher John Searle. John Searle argues that the purpose of language is to communicate a knowledge of the object of language. When I say car, what's happening on your end is not just a knowledge of the symbols that used to represent it, but the idea that's represented by car, right? And so you see the object-oriented view of someone like Searle, which is reinforced by someone like Hubert Dreyfus, who basically said that, the object of human knowledge is not information about the world, but the world itself. So obviously, if you take that seriously, we should start to take, and again, I think there's good reason to take that seriously, because the purpose of education is not just to memorize facts, it's to understand the world. That's the purpose of education, is to help people better understand and think about the nature of reality. So if that's something you take seriously, then we need to see a shift away from a more calculative or computational view to a more phenomenological view. And then finally, what I would say is that we need to change our attitude towards AI. AI is not going anywhere. In fact, when used correctly, it can bring about major benefits in education. But the last thing I'd like to just say is that if we use AI properly, it can deepen the learning process. It can deepen our cognitive processes, but it can't replace it. And that's what a lot of people do. They want to replace the process of thinking and doing. What we need to do is it's a tool meant to enhance our cognitive processes. It's never meant to replace it. And once we get a better attitude towards artificial intelligence, then we'll start to see true progress. So again, shifting our cognitive priorities, changing our attitude towards AI, and that will reverse a lot of the negative trends that we've been seeing in education. So.
That was wonderful, Paul. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely job.
Good job.
We've got about 10 minutes for questions, which is always a lovely thing. Does anybody want to kick off commentary, questions, all that good stuff? Undergrads, yes, sir. Or ma'am, sorry.
I have a question for you. Do you think as AI improves over the years, do you think it could almost create an adaptation to the human brain to think, like almost create a limit to the way humans think emotionally?
That's actually very interesting. I think I'm not, to be honest, I mean, AI is changing so rapidly. I think it's anyone who claims to be able to predict, yes, this is how it's going to unfold. I mean, just within the past few years, generative AI went from a relatively obscure technology to being everywhere. So what ways it ends up changing depends on how the AI technology develops and also how much we choose to lean into it. I could see it having some sort of effect. I think, obviously, in the past, I mean, you just see this just with anyone broadly in the 40 and younger categories. They started to use more and more of the internet, social media. There's been definite changes in a lot of our patterns. I mean, for example, short-term memory is suffering when you get everything instant gratification. Not just one obvious example. There's also examples of certain other areas of our cognitive abilities being strengthened by AI. I could see it having an impact on our cognitive processes, though if by changing the emotional elements you mean like replacing it and making us more robotic, I don't think that'll happen. I think people may try to, because I think the emotions are so built into our cognitive processes. Now, people may try to, I think the more isolated people become, the more people will try to use AI and just the internet in general to replace those things that they lost through isolation. But I don't think the AI itself is going to actually replace it or be able to weed it out. But that would be interesting because, again, the more we use certain types of technology, the more it influences our thought patterns. And therefore, I think it's like a stay tuned for more kind of thing because it's unfolding so rapidly. People are just catching up to the effects of the cognitive influence just within the past 10, 15 years. So, but interesting question.
Eleanor, did you want to add anything?
I would just say that I don't know if this is exactly your point, but even as we speak, right, people who are heavy social media users are having their affective sort of frameworks shifted because attention is not connection, right? And so if you're plugged into social media all the time, you might be getting a lot of attention and it might seem for momentarily like connection, but it's not, right? And so it may be that in a funny sort of way, it's going to bring more into focus the particularly human affective needs that we have.
Other questions? Yes.
This is to Cole. I mean, one thing that I found interesting. I mean, throughout the day, I'm thinking, how do we preserve human teachers?
Yeah.
Is the AI going to be a better teacher? And I thought some of the studies that you've talked about were interesting. So for example, the students reported they preferred the feedback from the AI about the same, or that there was the other one when they reported that AI helped them understand better than the human teachers. And it would just be interesting to look at, and I don't know if you really looked at this, but there might be a distinction between actually giving them a better understanding and whether it's maybe just giving them a sense of a feeling that they understand, right? Yeah. Because, and I don't know the exact setup, but, of course, the way ChatGPT is, everything you ask it, oh, you're brilliant, that's such a great insight, right? So, yeah, you're probably going to get a feeling that, right, maybe I really am understanding this better, right? And so I'd really just wonder, something to look more at is, is it just students feel that they're learning better, and then is that actually backed up with their performance, and just something to think about there.
Yeah, and that's actually a very interesting point because obviously, whenever you add the emotional element to anything, that's, gonna change the dynamic a whole lot. I'd love to see a follow-up study to this one just to actually see how did it actually, because it was specifically within the context of evaluation of student performance. So I'd like to see a follow-up of how well did the AI actually do, was there a considerable change? But the thing is, it made a distinction between reflection and understanding. And it sort of said that, human teachers are better at thinking about reflection, which is different than understanding. And how they were defining understanding is just the ability to sort of grasp information in terms of 1 + 1 is 2, here's why. But then, or in terms of this is how they make lemonade or something, which I think could lead to an interesting path forward in terms of, human, it shows why I think the human is indispensable, because machines are just information processing. It doesn't have that sort of reflective phenomenological element. So I could see a human computer sort of working together in education. But again, this then presupposes sort of my main thesis that we recognize the sort of multifaceted nature of human knowledge. And if we do that, there's going to be a place for AI, but it can never replace the human element, right? Because, AI lacks that sort of reflective knowledge. So.
Well, just actually, there has been a study done on this very question by MIT. It came out very recently, where what they did is compared AI tutors. How many have used Notebook LM? Or
heard about
things
that.
It's getting very popular as explaining things. They make up podcasts for particular topics and things like that. I've recommended it to my students, and what they did is they compared score results and various things, where they had an experimental group which used only AI tutors, and then those who actually just tried to study on their own. And they discovered that actually the people who studied on their own tended to do better than the ones who used the tutors. And the hypothesize is because it's kind of like working out a muscle, that the harder it is to do, the more your brain actually develops the kinds of skills that it needs to not just passively understand, but come up with information on your own. And so. Whereas something like Notebook LM or those various where they were very good at explaining, so it was kind of like somebody chewing your food for you. And so.
An excellent anti-marketing campaign, right?
Birds.
That's right, there you go.
The way that we say that in psychology is that it's infantilizing, right?
Yeah,
I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But couldn't you say that's, in a sense, the exception that proves the rule? Because when you have to actually think through it, instead of just having the information fed to you, it's like, imagine if, Einstein or, Dostoevsky, everything they ever said just went straight into your brain and you automatically saw things the way they did, as opposed to having to actually think through it and trying to understand. So you could say that the act of understanding in the sense of the empirical grasping of stuff in itself kind of presupposes the phenomenological or conceptual element.
I do have one more question. I love what's going on here, but I do have one more question, so we're going to go ahead and get that in before we close up.
Thank you. And so my question is specifically to you. And in the paper, somewhat in the middle, you were talking about some notions and mindset. And so I thought like what you are presenting is basically a notion or a mindset. And so I think that the notion or a mindset is just like an opinion or a matter of opinion, not like some truth or not like some matter of fact. It could be true also, but the notion could be wrong also. My mindset could be wrong also. So notion is just a notion or just an opinion. And so in the end you said, while concluding, that AI can deepen our cognitive process, but that will be if we have a change in attitude towards AI. That is so, like the end of your conclusion, basically, that is also looking like a notion only. And or like if not, can you explain how you think that it will deepen the cognitive process? Like how to get to that conclusion thing. But like if it is a notion, then I understand it is just a notion.
Yeah.
But otherwise, try to explain how you think that AI can deepen the cognitive process, while it is, as you said, only just queuing for you.
Yeah.
I mean, then how can it deepen the cognitive process?
Yeah.
And,
Well, I believe that it can deepen the cognitive process if you use it responsibly. I feel like, a lot of the stuff that I said, even what Dr. Patterson said, comes from when an over-reliance, or when there's an over-reliance and people want AI to take the place of the reasoning process, then that's basically when it begins to undermine us. How AI can be used responsibly, obviously it's such a new technology, there's a lot we still need to learn, but I think we need to view AI as in the sense that we view every other educational tool, in the sense that it was never meant to replace human thought. And I think the best example can be seen in mathematicians. Mathematicians use calculators, but they could still do the equations by hand if they wanted to. Obviously, at least some of the best of them. So what I would say is if we can take that mindset and carry it over into other things, and that AI is supposed to be subordinate to the thinking process, then obviously as a tool that makes things more efficient, it could, it could deepen the process, but only insofar as it doesn't replace what's happening. Like, what did you have to go through when you had to basically go through your studies? Like, as long as it's not trying to replace that, there is opportunity for it to deepen the process if you view it like the way we view calculators or just the internet more generally.
It's an excellent answer. We are at 2:02, so I don't want to keep any of you. I want to say thank you so much for being here. The fabulous Cole and the fabulous Eleanor. I'm sure.
Great job.
Thank you so much.